Welcome to the public forum on populism in Global South, lessons from Latin America, South Asia, and Thailand. Today we have 4 panelists together, and I would like to welcome the panelists first by introducing them to you. First, Professor Carlos de la Torre. He is the professor in the Center for Latin America Study at University of Florida, Gainesville. And this is going to be organized according to who will speak first and second. The next person is Tritep Singam. He is a PhD student at the University of Florida, Gainesville as well. And he and Professor Torre wrote a book on global populism, which has been translated into Thai right here. Actually, it has been translated into Spanish too, and this is like the 3rd language translation. I mean, English, Spanish, and Thai, right? So it should come out, well, this is what we have right now, and it should be on sale pretty soon. So the next person who will be speaking third is Professor Titinan Pongsutirak, right? He is with the IR department here at Chulalongkorn. And the last person is Professor Niti Neungchamnong. He is with the Faculty of Social Science at Naresuan University. Okay, and I'm Galaya. I'm with the IR department here at Chulalongkorn. Right, so because we got a little bit delay, so I'm gonna go in and let you speak right away. But before I do that, I would like to thank the ISIS, the director of ISIS, for helping me organize this forum. I'd like to thank the Frederick Naumann Foundation for their support in organizing this forum as well. Okay, this is how we're gonna organize the forum. Each panelist will have 15 minutes to discuss. First, Professor Carlos de la Torre will discuss the theoretical debates on populism. Then Tritep will discuss the implication of that theory on populism in Latin America, some case studies, and in Thailand. Followed by Ajahn Titinan, who will discuss populism in Southeast Asia and Thailand. And finally, Ajahn Niti will discuss populism in the Philippines. Okay, so without further ado, please welcome.
Well, Dr. Galaya Charegojin, thanks so much for your very kind invitation and introduction. It's a real honor and privilege to be here presenting this book that we produced with Tritep, whose nickname and how he introduced to me is Pepe. So if I call him Pepe, that's how he introduced himself to me. I also want to thank the colleagues who are going to be presenting this book, Professor Tintinem Ponsudik and Dr. Niti Neungchamnong, so much. And it's such a privilege to be at Chula University. Tritep and I have lived under authoritarian regimes for most of our lives. And so when we wrote this volume, it was a moment in which Trump has already instigated his supporters to take over the Capitol, to do not recognize an election that he has lost. And he claimed that there was electoral fraud. So for us, the election of Trump, and of course you have other people winning elections, other populists winning elections all over the world, we noticed that populism was not longer confined to the global South, meaning to Latin America, to Africa, or to Asia. It was a global phenomenon. So our big concern was to understand what are the relationships between populism and democratization. So the first thing that we want to do in this book that I'm so proud that it has been translated to Thai. We also have a translation to Spanish. So what we do in this book is first of all talk about what populism is, the different conceptual debates on populism. The second thing is to focus on what populists do. Then we decided to talk about the different populisms because we have different types and different forms of populism. And finally, what I'm going to talk about is the distinction between democracy and inclusion, and to talk about the possible return of fascism. So let me jump into the presentation. So I'm sorry it's not that clear, but anyways, when we talk about populism, we have two epistemological perspectives. The first perspectives are positivist, and they want to, and the aim of positivist or positivist social science is the accumulation of knowledge. So what they want to do is to present short, clear-cut definitions that can travel in time and that can travel in space. So you aim to have a definition of populism that will apply to the past and the present and to different world regions. So the first thing that they have to do is to see what is the domain of populism. So for the ideational school, and here the name of Casmude is the most important, and also his co-author, Cristobal Rovira, Calwatzer. So for them, populism is an ideology. It's a set of ideas about politics, and it's a set of ideas about politics as a Manichaean moral struggle between the virtuous people and the evil elite. So the domain for them is morality. Populism for them is the politics of morality, but also populists appeal to the general will of the people. So they tend to operate, or they operate in the democratic camp. Different from this positivist definition, we have the strategic political definition of populism associated with the name of Kurt Weyland. And for him, populism is a strategy to get to power and to govern, and he focused much more on the leader's strategy to get to power and to stay in power. So the domain of populism is politics. It's not morality, it is politics. And the other of populism are organized followers, because according to Weyland, populism tends to work when followers are predominantly disorganized, when they are not members of political parties or trade workers' unions, when they are in a state of disorganization. Now, these two definitions that are very widely used in the political and social sciences, especially the ideational definition, are very strong, are very sound, are very elegant, but they are reductionist. For instance, Mude, the ideational school, does not take into account leadership. And without the role of the leader, you can explain European right-wing populists who are at the margins of the political system, but you cannot explain populism in the global south or the successful cases of populism in the United States with Trump, which are very leader-centric. And the problem with the strategic political definition is that he doesn't consider ideology when he talks about populism. For him, populists are totally pragmatic and totally instrumentalist. They do not have an ideology. And that's a problem, because populists have an ideology or pretend to have an ideology. So to counteract these two positivist definitions, we have Ernesto Laclau's definition. Ernesto Laclau is a very interesting character because he was an Argentinian social theorist, and he was a left populist. So his work, his project throughout his lifetime was to understand the specificity of populism, but to link populism to democratization. For him, populism was democratizing, whereas for Weyland, populism is against democracy, and for Mude, it can be for and against democracy. So what does Laclau do? Differently from positivists, he doesn't construct a binary definition. Populism is not distinguished from other categories, it's rather a gradation. For Laclau, populism and the political are synonymous. So for him, the question is not whether or not a movement is populist, but to what extent it is populist. So what populists do is, it's a political logic, it's a way of understanding politics. Populists do not face political rivals. And with political rivals, you can discuss, you can disagree, and you try to convince them. Populists face enemies. They face existential enemies. So the logic of populism is very based on Carl Schmitt's idea of the conflict between friend and enemy. Populists face existential enemies that need to be contained. And what populists do is when different demands cannot be met individually by the state, they create a change of equivalency in which the name of the leader could lead to the rupture of the political system. Let me illustrate that with two examples. In the case of Venezuela, with Chavez, and with Chavez meant several things to different constituencies. For some, he meant the end of neoliberalism. For some, he meant the end of corrupt political parties. For others, it meant the regaining again of political sovereignty that was surrendered to the United States government. So it was an anti-imperialist thing. The name of Trump can be anti-immigration, right? It can be make America first, whatever that means. It could be going against the liberal elites. And if you go into conspiracy theories, it means stopping all of these diabolical conspiracies of the Democratic Party, etc., etc. So the name of the leader symbolizes a series of unmet demands and could lead to the rupture of the system. So those are the two main definitions of populism. You also have a performative and ideal types. I don't want to enter into that because I don't want to bore you to tears with different definitions. But what I want you to get out of this is that, first of all, with populism, you have very strong conceptual and theoretical debates that tend to have to do with the epistemological position of the researcher. Whereas for some, the aim of the social sciences is the accumulation of knowledge. Others are not obsessed with that and want to have more broader definitions that take more into account different aspects of the phenomenon. So if scholars cannot agree on what populism is, we propose with Pepe to focus on what they do. And we take things from the different approaches. So the first thing that we do is that we take from Laclau the idea that populism is a political logic that divides the polity and society into two antagonistic camps. These are camps of existential enemies. Think about Trump. Trump is not facing democratic rivals. Biden, for him, is the devil. Democrats are the devil. And I'm quoting, I mean, he says those terms, right? So he's facing enemies that are an existential threat to the United States. A second thing about populism is that when they talk about the people, they do not talk about the whole population of a nation state, but only to a sector of the population that they consider to be the real people. So if you're a left populist, like Chavez in Latin America, the real people are the poor, are the underprivileged, are those at the bottom of society, are the many, and the anti-people are the elites, the few. If you are an European or an American right-wing radical populist, the people is constructed with ethnic and racial terms and religious terms. So Muslims are not real part of the people in France or in the United States because of their religion. And in the United States, people who are non-white are not really considered to, and it depends, right? If you look Latino, the immigration services can stop you and ask you for your ID. If you happen to look white, they will not do that because they have these racialized images of who are part of the American people. And finally, the third characteristic of populism is that the leader of populism is not just a regular politician. For the most part, they are his. So that's what I'm going to say, the word he. He presents himself as the embodiment of the people. And the leader has a mission. The mission to save the people from oppression. So Chavez had the mission of saving Venezuelans from US imperialism, had the mission of saving Venezuelans from neoliberalism, from corrupt political parties. Trump also has a mission. So these politicians are not regular politicians that go for 1, 2 terms and stay in office, and then they go and create a foundation and make money and are happy traveling around the world. No, they have missions. In the Bavarian sense of the term. They have a calling, and they have to fulfill that calling. Now, all populists are not the same. So the first distinction that I would like to make is when populism are seeking office, when populism are out of power. When populists are out of power, they tend to talk about issues that other politicians do not talk about. They tend to talk about very important issues that need to be taken into account by political elites. When they get to office and they control one or two powers of the state. They enter into conflicts with the other powers of the state. Let's think about Trump, the first Trump. The first Trump was elected in 2016, but he did not control the whole state, right? He did not control the judicial or the legislative power necessarily. So they have a lot of conflict with the other powers of the state. But then a few populists are able to transform the constitution and or the electoral system and are able to create populist regimes. When I think about a populist regime, I will think about Chavismo, Chavez in office. He changed the Venezuelan constitution, he changed the name of Venezuela, he changed the emblem of Venezuela, he created a new regime, which was a populist regime. So I think that we have to make a distinction between these three moments of populism. When they are seeking office, I think that their proposals could be democratizing, could be very critical to the system, have to be taken into account. When they get into office, they enter into conflicts with the powers, with the institutional powers that are in office, and they can succeed or they can fail. The first Trump failed. He lost an election. He went home. Of course, he came back. But anyways, it's not a given that populists will win over these confrontations. And the third one is when populists are able to create a new regime. The second distinction are between the left and the right. When I think about left populism, they construct the people as those at the bottom of society, the poor, the downtrodden, the oppressed. And of course, the enemies of them are the rich, are the oligarchy, to use the term that they have always used in Latin America, and it's coming back in the United States to talk about the oligarchy in the United States, the very rich, the very wealthy, who control political, social power, etc. Right-wing populism constructs the people differently. As I said before, for them the people is constructed with ethnicity and race, and or with religion and culture. So these two types of populism are different. Right-wing populism tends to be much more authoritarian because, of course, what do you do with the other, right? What do you do with those who are considered to be the other? They should leave the country, they should go back to their country of origins, but what about their kids who have been socialized? Let's think about many Latinos in the United States and or Haitians in the United States who do not even speak the language, who have never been in their country where their parents or grandparents came from, and because they don't have regular papers, what are you going to do with them? So I think that right-wing populism is much more authoritarian. And the other distinction is between inclusion and democratization, and let me focus on that. I think that populists, especially left-wing populists, or when populism first arises in a political system, and I am thinking about Latin America in the 1930s or 40s, or I'm thinking about African populism in Zambia in the 1990s, or even Thaksin in Thailand, they could be inclusionary. They include those at the bottom of society. They include those who have been ethnically, culturally, politically, and socially oppressed. But they are not democratizing. They are not democratizing because populist inclusion is given on the condition of loyalty to the leader. So let's think about the case of Venezuela. If you were from the working class and you did not like Chavez, you are betraying Chavez, the people, the nation. You are part of the non-people. You don't have any right to exist. So that's a problem because populism is inherently authoritarian because the leader is ultimately the person who defines what the characteristics of the people are and what are the conditions for their inclusion. And finally, because the leader is the embodiment of the people, he doesn't have to be bound by formal institutions. Formal institutions such as constitutions, democratic procedures, all of those things are considered to be impediments, to be like all of these things that do not allow the will of the people to be expressed as it should be expressed. I always push the wrong button. So if you make a distinction between populism, inclusion, and democratization, I think that we can overcome two important misconceptions in the literature on populism. The first one is the idea of Casmude that populism could be either a friend or a foe to democracy. Perhaps that's when populists are out of power, but when populists are in power, even the best populists, best in quotation marks, like Chavez, I don't think that they were friends of democracy. Second, and most importantly, we have what Chantal Mouffe calls the two-strand theory of democracy. And she argues that democracy, that liberal democracy, is the contingent result of two historical understandings of democracy. First of all, the liberal component that focuses on rights and the protection of rights, the rights of the individual, and the democratic component that is based on the notion of equality and political sovereignty. And the idea is that liberal democracy protects too much individual rights without taking into consideration equality and popular sovereignty. And she has a point. I mean, we have seen all over the world the increase on inequality, and appeals to national sovereignty have been muted because there was a fear after Nazism that appeals to national sovereignty could lead to new manifestations of fascism. But I think that this critique is flawed because of one fundamental mistake. In order to have democratization, we need to have rights that protect the individual, so the individuals can join organizations in civil society, so we can have a public sphere where different opinions could be formed and articulated. So for me, there is not an either or. I think that you need basic democratic freedoms in order to make democracy more meaningful. And second of all, democracy is always an unfulfilled project. I mean, when I think about democracy, I don't think that we have to go back to the past, but we have to further democratize real existing democracies. And my last point is that nowadays, let me drink some water. How am I doing in time? Okay. Okay. After Trump and then Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil told their supporters or asked their supporters to defend democracy by taking over the powers of the state, the debates on fascism came back. So many scholars, and not only scholars, and not only the left, but also what I consider moderate politicians like Kamala Harris and people who have served under Trump, say fascism is coming back. Trump is a fascist. So for me, it's very important to see the difference between populism and fascism. And I think, and I apologize that my PowerPoint is not very clear. I am terrible with technology. But they have three things in common. First of all, both fascism and populism consider politics to be a struggle between friend and enemy. Second of all, they partake in this pars pro toto dynamic in which a sector of the population represents the people as a whole. And finally, for both of them, leadership is the embodiment. The populist or the fascist leader has a mission to save the people. But they are fundamentally different in the sense in which they construct the enemy. Whereas the fascist enemy has to be physically eliminated because they are bringing the destruction of the nation, of the family, of culture, right? The enemy of populism has to be confined. So what populists have done is to put their enemies in prison, have sent them to exile, but they have never engaged in mass killings as fascists have done it. Or you can include their Stalinists, but I don't want to talk about Stalinism because I will be here forever. So that's one of the main differences, the notion of the enemy, violence, the violence that is used against the enemy, and the fundamental legitimation strategies. For populists, the only legitimate way to get to power is to win elections. And in Latin America and in other parts of the world, populists struggle to expand the number of voters. They struggle against electoral fraud. So the legitimacy of populism is winning elections. Fascism got rid of elections, and they replaced elections with ceremonies of mass assent. So as long as Trump or Bolsonaro continue to believe in elections, they are in the democratic camp. However, what are they when they do not accept an election that they lost? Because they argue that there was electoral fraud. And finally, there is a problem of historicity, whereas populists have emerged at different historical moments in different societies with different levels of development. For the most part, historians say that classical fascism emerged at a particular point in time in the interwar period in Europe, and that whatever came after that was post-fascism. So I don't want to go too much into that because I'm almost out of time, but if we can think that fascism will return, we have to see the return of physical violence against enemies, vision of exclusionary nations that require the use of force to forcibly remove the other, and authoritarianism over democracy. And so for this to happen, first of all, they will have to invent total enemies. People constructed as the other, as a threat to society, as a threat to the family, and the others, or the total others that some of the radical right-wing populists, and especially Trump, is constructed are non-white immigrants. Non-white immigrant populations of colonial origin are considered to be the total other for Trump. They cannot be assimilated. They are considered the total other for right-wing European populists, like Le Pen. The second total other are the proponents of gender ideology. This notion, gender ideology, that was invented by the Catholic Church or by intellectuals of the Catholic Church, argues that people that propose gay rights, women's rights, changes in sexual identity are attacking the family. And for them, the heterosexual nuclear family is the base of society. And without a family, you cannot have a society. So all of these enemies are feminist. And especially with Trump, we see that non-sexual binary people do not have a right to exist any longer in the United States because according to Trump, you have to be a man or a woman. You cannot choose your identity, your gender identity. And finally, and you cannot read it very well, it's Marxist. And it's very interesting that Trump considers to fight against communists and Marxists when Bolshevism and Marxism is no longer a threat. In the 1920s and 30s, there was a fear of a communist revolution. It was there, it was a possibility. But nowadays, what is the threat of Marxism? It doesn't exist. But it exists this idea that you have intellectuals, that you have college professors, that you have state bureaucrats in the deep state that are following Marxist ideas that are totally alien to the fabric of American politics. So I want to leave it there. I have talked a lot. I talk about different conceptual approaches, our idea on what's a better way of understanding populism, the relationship of the different types of populism, the relationship of populism with inclusion and democratization, and finally, something that is bothering me a lot because I live in the United States and I'm living it, the possible return. I don't know if I will call it fascism, but the possible return of post-fascism or the end of democracy. So I leave it there. Thank you, Pepe.
Wonderful theoretical foundation that you laid for us. So, so my name is Tritep Sisanga Pepe. Currently a PhD student at the Department of Political Science, University of Florida. So my research is primarily about populism and regime transition. And so we wrote this book together back in 2019, 2020 during COVID time. There's so many chapters in it, but there will be, the analytical framework that we use in this book. So let me talk a bit about the chapters that we have in this. The first two chapters would be something that Dr. De La Torre talked about, the theoretical framework. And then the majority of the book, the biggest part of the book would be chapters on different regions of the world before, the latter part of the book would be about populisms and other kinds of stuff like populism media, populism and fascism. So for my presentation today, I'll be talking about, the populism in two regions, Latin America briefly, and then to focus more a bit about Thailand. right? And in order to, be able to analyze different regions in the world, we come up with this analytical framework to look at what populists do, right? We come up with 4 things when we analyze different regions. The first one would be that we look at the crises, right? Different crises that paved way to the rise of populists to power. In many parts of the world, it is mostly about economic crisis, right? Chavez, which I will talk about, and Dr. De La Torre talked about briefly before. Chavez came up to power, rose to power in 1998 after a huge economic breakdown in Venezuela, same way as in Bolivia, same way as in Ecuador, right? Apart from economic shocks and economic crisis, there are cases where populists rose to power after, huge corruption scandals, huge legitimacy crisis, especially in the 1980s in Latin America as well, in Latin America nowadays as well, in Argentina, in Brazil, for example. And lastly, there are cases where populists rose to power after public security matters, public security crisis. Think about the Philippines with the rise of Rodrigo Duterte, right? The loss of, domestic security, crimes, insurgency. And secondly, we looked at the linkages, different kinds of linkages that the populist leaders have with the followers, right? It could be just charismatic personalization, like the charisma of the leader, right? How well the leader used their own charm and charisma to connect with the followers, with the voters. And then we also look at organizations as well, because some people some scholars would argue that, populist leaders don't care about creating organizations like political parties, but in reality, there are cases, tons of cases where populist leaders did create parties or some kind of organizations like mass parties, some kind of movements like Thaksin and the Red Shirt movements, right? And more recently, there are cases, especially in Europe, Southern Europe, where populist parties created some kind of social network, digital networks as well. And then we all look at the traditional way of patron-client, right, clientelism as well, that still play quite an important role in many cases for populist leaders and followers. And we also look at the media ecosystem, right? Because we argue in our book that populists are savvy media personnel, if you will, starting from traditional ways, traditional means like television, radios, and then we also look at the more modern one, like high-tech social media engagement and some kind of television programs as well. And then we also look at thirdly, the constructions of the people and enemies, as Dr. De La Torre talked about, right? Like there are different ways in which different kinds of populists created the people and the enemies. We looked at the boundary markers, sometimes classes, not too much, but regions, religions, ethnicity, morality, and more recently, generation. We also look at some kind of moralized antagonism, right? The way the two camps got polarized, got divided, got separated as well. And lastly, we looked at the relationship between populism in that region and democracy, right? Whether it's how democratizing, how inclusive it has been, but what are some autocratizing elements that we see as well, right? And the impacts that populist leaders have had on the institutional framework of the state, for instance. So let me start with Latin America. In Latin America, in our book, we argue that, we agree with lots of scholars that there are 4 waves of populisms, starting from the very first inclusion, I would say, of Latin America, of the working class, to political arena. We call that wave classical populism between the 1930s all the way around until the 1950s, 1960s, when military coups, were happening all across the region in Latin America. And then the second wave took place after the re-democratization took place in the region. We call that wave neoliberal populism, with figures like Alberto Fujimori, Carlos Menem in Argentina, Abdallah Bucaram in Ecuador, and some would say Alvaro Uribe in Colombia. What's different is that in this wave, in the second wave, neoliberal populism, these popular leaders, they had huge popularity. They won massive votes in the elections, presidential elections, but they had neoliberal economic policies which decreased the size of the state. So it's some kind of paradoxical there. And I'm going to talk briefly about the two more recent waves today. The radical left populism, which took place in the late 1990s all the way until late 2010s, and the far right populism that is happening nowadays. Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, and Javier Milei in Argentina. You see there the guy with the chainsaw with Elon Musk. They're all friends. Yeah. So radical left populism, right? The crisis that paved way for them to rise to power would be the neoliberal collapse, right? Latin America saw the structural change economically and economic shocks throughout the 1980s and early 1990s due to what we call the debt crisis, right? The lost decade. And then, the state just disappeared, social services were lacking, and then party system, politically speaking, got imploded as well. The traditional politicians, they didn't have any legitimacy, and there came this, newcomers, these outsiders, people like Chavez, people like Rafael Correa in Ecuador, people like Evo Morales in Bolivia, who had lots of charisma, and they promised to come back, to come in politics, and to change, to refound the nation, right? To bring back dignity to the country. And then these populist leaders in this wave, they are left-wing in the sense that they created people, el pueblo, as an image, having an image of the working poor, the urban poor, the rural poor as well, the indigenous people, the excluded majority. Enemies are what Dr. De La Torre talked about, the elites, right? The political elites, the traditional elites. And then they first had a kind of a promising outlook, right? They wanted to bring more democracy to these countries where there were lots of inequality. But then later on, as Dr. De La Torre talked about, these populist leaders, they changed the constitution so many ways. And one of the ways they changed is that they changed the constitution and electoral laws so that they could prolong in power indefinitely in many cases, like in Venezuela, in Bolivia. For radical right populism, it started all the way in the US, of course, in 2016 with the electoral victory of Donald Trump. But then, the influence went down to Brazil with the victory of Jair Bolsonaro and Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, and Javier Milei most recently in Argentina. Two causes would be the corruption scandals, especially in Brazil, and rising violence and crime in El Salvador, right? El Salvador was one of the most insecure countries in the world due to high crime rates, right? The linkages here would be personalist digital campaigns, right? Punitive securitization as well, and usually they would have weak outsider parties, but they won overwhelmingly in presidential elections, right? Constructions of the people and enemies for the right-wing cases here, it would be the good citizens, the good taxpayers, versus corrupt political caste, criminals, feminists, the globalist left, right? That Dr. De La Torre talked about as well. And some of them are really hyper-nationalist, like Jair Bolsonaro and Milei, very masculinist symbolism, very machismo, right? And we can talk a bit more about this in the second round, about whether this fourth wave would lead to more democracy or more autocracy or something else, right? Now let me talk about Thailand, right? Two cases that we looked at in case of Thailand. Of course, I have to talk about the guy, right? Another uncle, if you know what I mean, Thaksin Shinawatra, but with asterisk there. And the second case that I talked about would be about the Orange Party, the Future Forward Party, the Move Forward Party. And, well, I think Dr. Janiti might talk about this as well, is the misconceptions of populism in Thailand. So when we talk about populism in Thailand, we tend to think about, expansive macroeconomy, right? Money handout, right? It's just about fiscal irresponsibility. But as Dr. Torre pointed out, and as we pointed out in the book, populism is more than that. It's not just about, if ever, about fiscal irresponsibility, right? It's about, dividing the society into two camps, right? And misconceptions of populism in Thailand also involves the overlooking of redistributive justice and programmatic appeals beyond just, mere cash handouts. And sometimes progressive social policies are labeled populist panhandling by many media outlets, right? The reason why I included Future Forward Party here and or Move Forward Party, Prak Prachachon, we can debate about that. The reason why I included these two is because I had an interview with one of the founders of the Future Forward Party, and he told me explicitly that he built the party exactly by Ernesto Laclau's book. And he built the party based on left-wing populist parties in southern European countries like Spain, Podemos, like Greece, Syriza, like Le Cinque Stelle in Italy. Right? For Thaksin, right, of course, we all know, right, that he rose to power after the Tom Yam Goong crisis, right? High rural debt, service gaps, rising inequality, right? And now, once he was in power, he wasn't quite a populist back then. He didn't really call for, separation between the people. The Pride and the Mad didn't really appear, right, during his first term. But once, he got, there were protests, mass protests by the yellow shirt, right, and later on the Kapapasa. Thaksin and his supporters became more and more polarized, right? The enemies got constructed as the Ahmad, right? I still remember quite well when I was in Demodome and also at Chula, lots of protests. We heard all the Pride and Ahmad rhetoric all the time, right? So Thaksin became more and more populist throughout the last days of his second term, and especially after he went into self-imposed exile abroad. And towards democracy and autocracy, we see, right, that Thaksin exploited quite several times his supermajority in parliament to pass to do stuff that really benefited him and eroded effectively checks and balances, right? Agency captures, constitutional tweaks, and that culminated with the military coup in 2006. So for the Future Forward Party and the Move Forward Party, of course, the party rose to fame, right, after the military coup in 2014 and the, re-liberalization, if you will, of politics in 2019, right, and stalled reforms, right? And there are tons of generational frustration that, exploded with the mass protests in 2020, if I remember correctly. Yeah, digital economic precarity as well. Linkages that the party had would be network leadership, right? Social media mobilization, crowdsourced policy platform, quite modern if you compare to, say, Thaksin, who relied primarily on television. Thaksin would have something like Thaksin Pop Prachachon, right? Thaksin meets the people every weekends, I believe, where he would talk, he would go to the farm. He also had, Thaksin would have something quite traditional like Tua No Kamin, if you could remember, where he would go to like rural provinces. But the Future Forward Party is more modern in that sense, right? It relies on a techno-savvy measures to mobilize and to connect with the voters. And then constructions of the people, we see, right, that it's the new generation, equal citizens across regions. It's the enemy, the military, the conservatives are clear enemies for the Future Forward or Move Forward Party, right? During Thanathorn leadership, it would be the people against the military, the people against dictatorship all the time. Whenever he campaigned or the party campaigned, the rhetoric was so salient. Now, when it comes to the Future Forward, the Move Forward, the rhetoric changed into new politics versus old politics, right? Towards democracy and autocracy, the party, by many, was viewed as like, the democratizing force, right? But we can talk about that in the second round or in Q&A, right? Conclusion. So crisis create opening. That's what we argue in the book, right? Populists supply ready narratives and solutions. Whether that solution would work or not, that's debatable. Most of the time, not, right? Linkage structures can vary, right? And linkage structures shape durability and regime to impact. People-enemy constructions could differ as well between the left-wing and the right-wing populists, right? And institutional strength, in some cases, like the US or Argentina, could mediate whether populism could widen or robs democracy. That's it for me.
Just continue, please.
Okay, thank you very much, อาจารย์กระยา Thank you ครับ First Carlos, thank you very much. คุณ Pepe, right? Yeah, Pepe, thank you. First, I would like to say that I'm a substitute for อาจารย์Jiwa couldn't be here, so I'm a second rate to begin with. Let me talk in a few directions. First, about populism itself, the nature. I mean, I appreciate all the definitions, and I'll have a look at your book, sure. And populism, I use it as one of the topics in one of my courses. So I look at populism in itself as a reaction. And then populism in autocracies, dictatorships, looking at some examples in both cases. And then the durability, capacity of state institutions in relation to populism, strongman rule. And then maybe a quick scan of Southeast Asia regimes and populists. So populism is fundamentally a reaction. It's not ex ante, it's always exposed. So something has to exist before populism comes along. So it doesn't stand on its own, not a standalone, it's a reaction to something. And the definitions that the Professor Carlos has laid out is antagonistic, adversarial, is mass versus elite. It tends to be anti-establishment. You use the example of Trump. I would like to pitch that in a different angle. So Trump is very controversial, and he's got a lot of detractors and critics. But you could say that Trump is a populist. But when you say Trump is a populist, what is he populist against? What is he populist for? What is he populist at? So Trump is a populist vis-a-vis the establishment. Now, what is the establishment in America? The establishment in America is twofold. There's the establishment within the Republican Party that he has vanquished and he has conquered. And there's an establishment in American politics, in American political life. So the Trump conquest of the Republican Party has taken 40 years. If you think about Trump, at the end, in the 1980s, there was a guy like him, there were several people like him, but leading the way in that time was a guy named Patrick Buchanan. Pat Buchanan was very populist. I can see some people that would, who are of a certain age that can still remember those days. You can see, Buchanan was like Trump. He said all the things that Trump said. America first. There's an article in the National Interest in 1990s, America first, second, and third. He talked about America great again, making America great. He's very anti-immigration, anti-immigrants, talked about building a wall and so on. So what happened then in the 1980s was when the Cold War ended, the established Republicans won the debate about what to do next. The debate was about, okay, we won the Cold War, we won the World War II, it's time to come home. That wing was a minority. And the majority was, no, we continue to engage. We make the world safe for American democracy, American capital, and so on. And those guys won the debate, and it led into the Bush wars and so on. In the interim, right? In the interim, American society changed with technology, globalization, and so on. So, to make it short, a lot of people felt alienated, excluded, marginalized. So So the population, the electorate, shifted, changed, and realigned. And by the 2010s, you can see that Trump won the first term, and then very small margins. Some people would say that he didn't really win, but nevertheless, he won. And then Biden kind of came along and disrupted the trend a little bit. And Trump too, you really see a full-fledged populist movement against the established Republican Party, which has now been taken over, but also in American politics, which has now been taken over. And now he's implementing all these policies that we're seeing. Now you can say that there is a populist against the establishment, but I can also say, and it sounds sacrilegious to say that it's kind of self-renewal. To a lot of them, to a lot of Trump base, this is self-renewal, from the corrosion, the corruption of the Republican Party in American politics for the last 40 years and even more. So on Trump, I think that, yes, populist against establishment, using the masses against the elite. The elites, who are the elites in America? He calls them the swamp. Who are the swamp? All the things that he's trying to get rid of now. Right? All the think tanks, the Doge, and all these lobbying firms and donors and all some of the businesses. Now, on Thailand, so that's my kind of Trump comment. It's interesting that Pepe drew comparisons or two cases of the Thaksin Thai phenomenon 25 years ago, and also the future forward, move forward, and I wonder if that is really that is populist. Thaksin was definitely populist. What was he populist against? Why do we call him a populist? He was the first to, and he has many problems, of course, and even to this day, right? He's cannot help himself. He has many problems. Even this week, he's on a campaign. He's on a talking tour. But back then, 25 years ago, when he formed the party in 1998, after the crisis in 97, and the party won the election in 2001, 2002, 2003, he woke up, he awakened. It was a massive awakening of the Thai electorate, right? He connected with the rural masses who had been excluded and marginalized. To that extent, he was a populist against the establishment. Now, who was and is the establishment in Thailand? The established centers of power in Thailand are the military, the bureaucracy, judiciary, and the monarchy. Right? They were forged, promoted, cultivated during the Cold War. Sometimes I call them the Cold War fighting machine that has outlived its original mandate and mantra. So, yes, Thaksin was populist against that establishment. Now, I would like to pose a question to Kun Pepe later on. Would you consider that General Prayut, was he a populist? Did he use royalism? To be a populist? Second question, and I think more to the point, is royalism populism? And if it is, then you think you have to kind of operationalize, and I don't know, you have to set up a certain methodology and a way of researching it. Otherwise, you would be missing really an elephant gap. So I talked about populism as reaction fundamentally, as a response to something that has been established. I have kind of scanned over the Thai case, the Trump case. Now let me talk a little bit about, it's interesting you mentioned the word machismo. Why a populist male? Can populists be female? We don't hear female populists. But, I'm thinking that Aung San Suu Kyi is populist. And then you get to the question of, well, was she, what kind of populist? She was certainly very popular. The NLD won massive landslides, right? 2010, 2015, 2020. Over 82% 2020. And she was wildly popular with the Myanmar people. But her ways and means, so I think something about the methods and means of populism, that she didn't quite fit that bill, but she was a populist of a certain type. But beyond that, we don't see a lot of populist female populists. And there's something that I think that's worth, it's not my PhD, so I'll leave it to you. There's something about, so gender there. Strongman rule, so populism, and we've seen examples in Latin America, Asia, strongman rule. So which countries around the world that we haven't seen populism come out of? So which countries are not populist? Which countries have not been populist? So you think about maybe the Nordic countries, Canada. We don't think of Canada. We don't liken Canada to a populist country. The Nordics. I don't even remember who was the prime minister. You remember populist. You remember the name. So this is another way of thinking. Well, what is populism and what is not? Some countries are not. And if you taking a survey around the state system, international system, you can kind of maybe come up with a even more precise definition with some cases and examples. The durability, and you use the word durability capacity of state institutions matter. So populists, strongman rule populists, they tend to come up where institutions are fragile, vulnerable, fractious, weak, and sometimes there's a reason that they come up because institutions cannot address popular demands and grievances, and therefore, you need someone, a knight, on a shining armor, a knight to come and rescue the situation, the country, and provide the answers. So I think institutions are important. In countries that are not populist, institutions are very strong. I mean, Canada, Nordic countries I mentioned, but even Japan. On the other hand, you also have the cases of North Korea, China, Vietnam, Tholam, Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping. Are they populist? Well, I don't think of them as populist. We don't think of them as populist. Is the Vietnamese Communist Party populist? Can a party be populist? No, it has to be someone, right? So I'm thinking that institutions are pretty strong. It happens to be a communist system. But Tholam and Xi Jinping will come and go. I mean, Kim Jong-un will stay a long time. And in that case, maybe the party is lesser than the individual. Finally, I'll just say a little bit about Southeast Asia. If you take a quick look around, we've had a bunch of autocrats, dictators over the decades. Let's say in Burma, had Ne Win. After Ne Win, who was a military dictator, was he a populist? No, he was not. He didn't need to be a populist because the state structure was so rigid, so entrenched, and fully under control, and with repression and suppression. The Marcoses, we'll hear from Janiti about the Philippines. Yeah, he was a populist, was he? In a way, but no, he didn't need to be a populist. So to be a populist in Southeast Asia, you have to react to something that's been established. Suharto was not a populist. Jokowi was kind of a populist. But they have very strong institutions, right? Strong enough to make sure that Jokowi Joko Widodo does not stay around more than 2 terms. So he got 10 years and that's it. Had they changed, if he was successful in changing that law and had a 3rd term, then you could see more populist traits and characteristics coming out of him. Is Lee Kuan Yew, the Lee family, was Lee Kuan Yew populist? Very small island state? I would say no. I mean, he didn't need to be populist because He had the legitimacy, the performative legitimacy, the political legitimacy, and he delivered. So if you ask Singapore people, Singaporeans, they like Lee Kuan Yew, by and large, but they wouldn't say that he's a populist. Malaysia, if you think about Mahathir, was he a populist? No, not really. I mean, he didn't need to be a populist. It's Anwar. Anwar needs to be a little bit of a populist. But he wouldn't fit into the conventional definition of populism. Hun Sen is not a populist. He likes to be popular, right? He wants to be popular, but he's not really a populist. He doesn't need to, stir up popular sentiments. When he does this with the border dispute, his nationalism, I don't see that as a kind of a expression, manifestation of his populism. Laos, similar to, do you remember who the Prime Minister of Laos is? We don't remember the name. If you remember the name, that's a sign of populism. If you don't remember the name, well, maybe it's not really that populist. What other countries we can look at around here? I mean, I mentioned already, Taiwan is not really populist-led country. Singapore, Brunei, Sultan. Brunei, you can ask a similar question as you can do with Thailand. So Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Brunei, Singapore, Malaysia. You have different streaks, different shades. Some populists, but when they operate and functional, when they're around, when you can see them, they are against something. And autocracies tend to be less of a fertile terrain for populism in Southeast Asia. Whereas I think democracies, the more democratic systems, you can have different definitions of how Southeast Asian democracies really qualify being democratic. But let's say they have electoral democratic systems. They're more prone to have a populist upsurge or challenge because the established system, over time, and this is very natural, over time, established systems, they get fat, they get inefficient, they become slower, they are not able to reinvent and address moving popular demands and expectations, especially when technology is galloping so quickly, and therefore they're prone to see challenges from outside the system, and these we call populism. Thank you.
Ajahn Niti, please. Next on the film.
So first of all, I would like to thank the ISIS for inviting me here. It's really honor to sit alongside two of my professors, Ajahn Jay and Ajahn Nok. And I feel very honored to sit alongside Professor Carlos. Back 7 years ago when I started writing this book, his extensive work on populism, I can use his book as like my springboard to do this one. So I really feel honored to sit alongside with him and Kun Pepe as well. I'm quite sure that in the future he will be like the cornerstone of the populist study and Latin American study in Thailand. So I would like to thank the ISIS for inviting me. And as for my presentation, it's part of this book. In this book, I have like 4 cases: Thailand, the Philippines, Peru, and Argentina. So because Kun Pepe already mentioned the Thai case, and Ajahn Jay mentioned the overall picture of the Southeast Asia. So I think I will focus only the Filipino case. And I will start with my key points. Actually, my points I would like to have the communication or debate or discussion with Kun Pepe and Professor Carlos' book, especially the 2 points. The first one, whether like the crisis is the necessary factor to the populism, to the rise of the populism. And the second one, whether the rise of the populism may like engender or lead to the demise of the democracy. By using the case of the Philippines, the first point is, I think in the case of the Philippines, the rise of the populist leader, the first round, President Estrada, and the second round, President Duterte. They both, like the rise of them occur without the real crisis. Back into 1997, one of the countries that saved from like the economic crisis is the Philippines. So it happened without the economic crisis. And in the case of President Duterte, in the Philippines, they have like quite the serious the criminal record. But if you look at the discourse or the campaign, electoral campaign, President Duterte tries to exaggerate or try to perform or showing the Filipino voter that we are like in the middle of the crisis. So I think in this case, in the Filipino case, they both like occur the rise of the populism without the real crisis, only the performing crisis. So that's the first point that I would like to raise. And the second one, the rise of the populism in the Filipino case does not necessarily engender the democratic breakdown. Only like, but it did negatively affect the quality of democracy, especially like the freedom, the liberty. Okay, that's my 2 points. And for the second round, I think the Filipino case is the perfect myth-busting case to disprove the common misconception or belief about populism, especially in Thailand. And Ajahn Thitinan mentioned one of the misconceptions, which can say like the trap of the blind man and the elephant. When like people study or talking about the populism, they just focusing on like the certain point, not the whole picture. So I will mention this point later on the second round. All right, let's go to the context. Ajahn Thitinan did really well in like providing the overall background of the populism in Southeast Asia. And another one that I like study is Professor Ben Anderson. In the edited volume, having Ajahn Pasuk and Ajahn Chris Baker as the editor, I think 10 or something years ago on the populism in Asia. One of the chapters is Professor Ben Anderson. He mentioned the rise of populism in the first round. I call the first wave of populism in Southeast Asia. It occurred in Indonesia under Sukarno and Burma under UNU. But the defining characteristic of the first wave was the anti-imperialism. And the enemy of the people at that time was like associated with the imperialists. But for the second wave, which began in the case of the Philippines during the President Estrada back into the late 1990s. It focusing on the economic dimension. I will go into the detail later. And regarding the context, I have to admit, I'm not an expert in the Filipino study or Filipino politics. But when we know about the Filipino case, we have to know the context. And because we have to know who the populist leader defined as the enemy. So the enemy in the case of the President Estrada is the oligarchy. It's from the colonial legacy. I don't know Spanish, so I'm not how to pronounce the encomienda and hacienda. Yeah, something like this. It's a system that put in place by the Spanish, and it still have the legacy, even though the Philippines already make a transition to democracy in late 1980s, and it create the so-called the political families ruling by gold, goon, and gun. And at some a point of time, the political family have control up to 2/3 of the parliament, and it create the difficult condition for the mass political party to emerge in the case of the Philippines, because they are under the control of the political family. And another context, economic dimension, is the persistent inequality. And they have a different type of inequality. For example, the land inequality and the income inequality as well. So that's the context of the rise of the President Estrada. So let's see. I call the populism during the President Estrada as the movie star populism. I think we all know that President Estrada, he was an actor before turning into politician, and his famous character is playing the guy who fighting for the poor, and later he found his party. I don't know the Tagalog as well, so I don't know how to pronounce this. But he left the political family intact, and he even co-op with the political families in order to win election. And as for the political platform or policy platform, he declared the war against poverty. But he doesn't have the clear policy program in his electoral campaigning. And at that time, he portrayed oligarchy elite as an enemy of the people, even though he co-op with them, with the political family. But he defined the oligarchy as the enemy of the people. And he tried to have the policy naming after him. His nickname is ERAP, E-R-A-P, ERAP. Or if we read in another way, it's called pare, is mean friend in the Tagalog. So he put his name ERAP for everything, ERAP for the poor, and even the convenience store. He put his name on the convenience store. So อาจารย์ Ajahn Jay mentioned that if we cannot remember the name, that means it's not populism. So he put his name everywhere, even in the a convenience store, and he tried to claim that he was the father to the mass. Okay, that's the rise of the movie star populism. But let's talking about the aid. If we study the Filipino democracy, the rise of the Filipino democracy is owing to the people power movement during the late 1980s, and unfortunately, the fall of the movie star populism was owing to the people power second movement. And it reminds me to the Yellow Church movement. Somehow it reminds me to the Yellow Church movement, who tried to overthrow the Thaksin regime. And after a lot of pressure, not only from the bottom up of the people power, but something that quite paradox at that time is the people power two, or the people power the second, comprising of the elite, comprising of the urban middle class, and including the Catholic Church. So that's why it reminds me to the Yellow Church. And he also faced the pressure from the army as well. But I call it the silent coup d'etat, because at the time of the heightening pressure from the people power movement, the army leader notified President Estrada that the army no longer support him. So he has to step down. And after the fall of President Estrada, there was the people power tree. And it reminds me to the Red Shirt as well, because most of his supporters were the poor. So it reminds me to the Thai politics as well. So let's see another tale of the populism in the Philippines. The rise of Duterte. I think we all accustomed to his story, his background, and his performance in suppressing or in doing the war on drug. He was an ex-mayor of Davao from the Mindanao, the southern, I think the southern part of the Philippines. And at that time, when he was the mayor, he waged the war against narcotic drug. And at that time, there were around 1,500 criminal suspects were killed during 1998 to 2015. But in terms of the economic policy, he promoted the neoliberalism as the key economic policy platform. And he tried to mobilize vote from the Filipino voter using the dark charisma or the dark charismatic. He tried to attack everybody. For example, he attacked the cardinal, the Catholic cardinal. He attacked the top businessmen and politicians. And he even attacked the major power including President Obama and the EU as well. I have the quotation, several quotations, but I don't want to read it. Just only one. He said, like, forget the laws on human rights, you drug pushers, because I would kill you. I would dump all of you into the Manila Bay and fatten all the fish there. So he mobilized water through the dark charisma. And as I mentioned earlier, he tried to, he used one of his strategies, performing crisis. I try to follow the official number of the drug addict. At that time, it's around 2 million people. But he exaggerated to almost 4 million people. So, and he described the Filipino as the narco state, and mentioned that the nation was on the brink of being fractured and under imminent disaster. So it's how he tried to perform the crisis. Okay, this is the comparison between the two periods. Let's see the similarity. I think they have something in common, especially the way they exercise the power. They exercise the power in really centralized, in really the pattern crime, relying on the pattern crime network. And they use the same but different policy. The same, they try to use the war for President Estrada, the war against poverty. For President Duterte, the war against the narcotic drug. And they share something in common regarding the economic policy, using the neoliberal economic policy. And I think they also have the same category of a corrupt elite that they would like to fight. That is the oligarchy. But the way that they climb up into the presidency, they have to co-op with the political family as well. So I think I will end up my first round here. Okay, thank you.
Well, thanking all the panelists. We only have half an hour left. So you get to say the second round with the question and answers. Okay? But right now, I would like to ask if you have any question for the panelists. Ajahn Paul.
Okay, thank you very much for all of your talks. So I
sorry, Ajahn Paul is the director of ISIS.
Okay, I forgot to introduce myself. So I'm director of ISIS. So thank you, Ajahn Thitinan, for performing this role in lieu of me. But my question is that certainly some key conditions you have mentioned, right, may contribute to the rise of populisms in many countries: economic crisis, huge corruption, charismatic leaders, etc., etc. But many countries may experience such conditions but do not fall into populism per se, right? So we may think about institutional strength like Ajahn Thitinan was mentioning, which normally associated with the developed countries, Western Europe, America, but we see populism rising in America in recent years, and in the past, in current situations, some of the Western European countries as well. So my question is the flip side of what actually gives rise to populism. What actually, or exactly, the factors contributing to prevent populism to rise?
Is there any more questions? Yes, please.
My name's Margaret McMillian. I'm a retired diplomat, but as I was listening to these very interesting presentations, the question that occurred to me, which might be a follow-on to the first one, is can progressivism be an antidote to populism? And I think particularly of the United States, classic time would have been at the beginning of the 20th century, when you had people like Eugene Debs as a socialist, you had William Jennings Bryan in the Democratic Party, and the response you got was a slew of progressive legislation from the administrations, particularly of Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and also to a certain extent from Taft, who was more conservative. So I'm just curious whether we see examples of that. Thank you.
กสิทธิ์พิรมยา and ISIS fellow. I have one short statement and two short questions. First, the statement. I was on the team of Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra in the course of the year 2001. So I was very much inside this big political personality of Thailand and his populist policy measures. But that needs another panel discussion. My question is this. Is populism identified with the word personality cult? And therefore, by extension, it undermines and eventually destroys the democratization process. That's the first question. Second question is, what are your proposals to various political parties to come out with a set of alternative policy measures to populism? Thank you.
I have a very simple question to Professor the Tories. Just very, very interesting the way you try to theorizing populists. My simple question is, can the global democratization avoid populism? Because throughout the globalization and democratization since 90s, the whole democratic society tried to include different parties from the exclude one, from the minorities one, and then the whole public policy tried make them count in political, agendas. Secondly, I'm very interested the way you bring the political theology points of view when you make the friend enemy distinctions into theorized populist politics, and this has come up with very strong aspect of friends, enemies, and also the political polarizations. As I think the book and your student Pepe try to analyze the Thai politics. For some reason, I think political theologies in terms of friends and enemies exist before populist politics, and the way polarization of political activities has come before, but how you underlie these political theologies, very strong key in order to analyze and give the whole account of political populist movement in throughout the Gulf.
I think I'll give the Mr.
Right, I'm going to start, and so before we get into these very wonderful questions, I want to tackle several questions that Ajahn Titinan raised a couple of minutes ago about the elephant in the room question. And actually, it's a question of exclusion inclusion criteria, right? When it comes to research, essentially, what is, for example, your question was Prayut and royalism populism or not, right? I would, in our book, we agree with lots of scholars that the criteria for a politician to be qualified as a populist or not, and how can we draw the line between an authoritarian, a dictator, and a populist would be the elections. The free and fair elections are key determinant of whether we would call that person a populist or an authoritarian leader. Take Venezuela as an example. So Chavez, when he came to power in 1998, he won the free and fair elections, right, as a democratic candidate in a free and fair elections. But once he was in power, he started to change regulations, the rules, in the way that the opposition could never win the elections. That's when he crossed the line from a populist. Not too much, because he still relied on elections. But the successor to Chavez, Nicolas Maduro, the current leader, he crossed that line already. Elections didn't matter at all anymore. He used authoritarian measures to continue to be in power. Hence, he's no longer a populist. Nobody would call him a populist anymore nowadays. Now, when it comes to Prayut, this is quite interesting, because if we are talking about Prayut in 2014, when he staged a coup using undemocratic means to get into power, definitely he was not a populist back then. But how was he in 2019 during elections? If you look at the campaign that he made, or some campaign materials that the Palang Pracharat used during that time, it was quite a nationalistic, little bit right-wing populist, I would say, in that the party, the Palang Pracharat back then, before the split, called for Thai unity, right? Peace and unity, the conservation of Thai traditions. I still remember the TV campaign, like young people, yelled at the parents, and the campaign ads asked whether we will live in this kind of future or not. And I think that could be a sign of that the Prayut, and back then not quite his party though, it's Pravit party, but anyway, that Prayut and his supporters or his colleagues try to use this us versus them rhetoric as well, like the traditional ways of life of Thai people and the modern ways of life of Thai people. So there is that question, whether elections play a role or not, whether that elections are free or fair or not, right? And then the question of the gender and gender of the populist that you raised as well. Eva Perón, she was a huge populist leader, right? The second or first wife of Juan Perón, of General Juan Perón in Argentina, and so many other people, right? And then the succession questions as well. Why, and that pertains a bit to Ajahn Paul's question, but not quite. I'll talk about that. The succession questions, right? Institutional changes are kind of tools where populists in many Western world, including Latin America, used to prolong power, right? They changed constitutions, they changed electoral rules, but that's different in Southeast Asia, where we see dynastic succession, right? Widodo didn't prolong power, but he changed the law so that his son could run as a vice president, right? Duterte didn't change the law to continue in power, but he coordinated with the Marcos to run together before they broke up, of course, and he sent his daughter to run as a vice president, right? So that's something that is intriguing, going quite a puzzle for me. So why we see institutional changes in Latin America, but quite a dynastic succession in Southeast Asia with these populists. And I'll leave Dr. Carlos to respond to other questions.
Well, thanks so much for the interventions of the colleagues in the roundtable discussion and for the questions. So let me address very briefly what Niti said about crisis. I totally agree with you. I mean, it's more important. I mean, a crisis could be a performance of a crisis, and populists have arisen also under conditions in which there is not a real economic crisis. The idea is, how do they perform or make people believe that there is indeed such a crisis? Because there has to be something there that is worrying the electorate, so they can perform this idea of immediacy, right? The idea that they have is that you either act now or the nation is going to disappear or the country is going to disappear. And I also really agree with Titi Dam's question about who populists are against. I think that's a very good question, because populism is not only for the people, but it's also against elites. And these two questions, the question of the people and the enemies of the people, can be constructed in many, many ways. Now, as you were saying, populism arises in conditions where you already have polarization and when you have the invention or the creation of enemies. So it's not that populists invent these enemies out of nothing. I mean, the idea of the illegal alien that Trump has been running against, I don't like the idea of illegal alien. First of all, to call foreigners aliens is very problematic. And then the idea of illegal, it's discriminalization. But anyways, it's an idea that has been present in the United States imagination for many, many years. And what Trump has done is use it. So when Trump was elected the first time, I think it's very important to make a distinction between the first Trump that was elected in an already polarized and fragmented society in which the parties were not trying to look for a middle voter. The parties were already polarized, and you have the creation of, I mean, Democrats were more open to, you know, to interculturalism, to multiculturalism. They were less religious, they were more secular, urban than rural, and the Conservative Party was different. They were much more rural, they were more looking inward, they were much more looking for, they were against this idea of multiculturalism, etc., etc. So the polarization and the division was already there, but what Trump did was to take it to new levels and to change, for instance, the inclusionary public sphere that the United States have been trying to work out since the movement of the 1960s. By inclusionary public sphere, I mean a public sphere in which sexism, homophobia, transphobia is not accepted as normal. And Trump also accepted right-wing extremist groups as normal, or normalized that. But the second Trump, I think, is a bit different. The first Trump, I would think, that fit in every definition of populism that I mentioned in my talk. I think that the second Trump, first of all, the moment in which he doesn't accept elections, or only accepts elections if he wins, makes me really worried. What is going to happen to the midterm elections in next year? Are we going to have those elections? Are we not going to have those elections if Trump knows that his party will not win? And that put the military in charge of civilian affairs. That's something that has never occurred in the United States, but it's the history of Latin America and it's the history of Asia. I mean, the military are the ones who are have the last say on what to do with democracy or not. Now, what to do with, how to prevent populism? Well, populism arises because populism is part of the democratic process. It's not a virus that comes from outside. It's part of the democratic process. So it could occur. You could have populist appeals, and you could have populist appeals like Buchanan, you were saying, but that didn't work. There are specific conditions where these appeals are successful or not. Now, we have to listen very carefully to the populist critique. I think that the populist critique to the inequalities that came with globalization, with all of this, it's something that the politicians have to address. So we cannot forget their critique, but we have to be worried about the solutions that they are presenting. Because even if the solutions sound nice, they could be very authoritarian because they lead to personalism, they lead to the anti-democratic results. And hold on, there is another question that I am looking for, and yep, well, I think that's, sorry. Sometimes when I take notes without marking these things, I get lost. The personality cult is very present in populism. I mean, populism is personalistic, it's authoritarian. That's what I think that you have to make a distinction between populists seeking power when their critiques could lead to the inclusion of people who have been marginalized and populists in power. Now, when are populists able to change institutions? They have only been able to do that when all of the institutions of democracy are in crisis, or when you have this extra money that comes from a commodity boom. Think about Venezuela. Chavez had all of this money that came from the petroleum boom in the early part of this century. So I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. First question about what constitutes or qualifies and underpins and drives populism. There are many factors, many contributing factors, but I would say the political economy of the various countries, that's where I would look. Also, in some cases, in a lot of cases, the colonial legacies, a lot of these populist polities are post-colonial. The point about progressivism is applicable and relevant. I think maybe even existential for Thailand. I think it's a very a good example or instructive example for us to really look at. So basically, populism exists where people are generally unhappy. They have to be unhappy people. If people are happy, they're not going to fall for populists. And by the way, personality codes, to Ambassador Kasit asked, populists can be personality codes, tend to be, exhibit traits of, but not all personality codes are populist. And so, for example, I was thinking of populists tend to be autocratic, but many autocrats are not populists. They don't need to be populists. The progressivism in the US is really, basically it's a realignment of society. You have conflict, but it's premised on compromise. That's why I think that Thailand is really looking for some kind of a compromise to align, to bridge this gap of traditional institutions. I mentioned established centers of power, tradition and modernity, if you will. And that gap has widened, has yawned markedly and I think dangerously in Thailand. So now you have, traditionalism trumping modernity, modernization. And as that gap widens, the pent-up demands and expectations for change and reform will increase, will become combustible. And the combustibility can lead to a kind of a cataclysmic change that you don't want. So progressivism is a kind of a halfway compromise, adjustment, reconciliation, if you will. So in the US, we saw that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and I'm hoping to see that in Thailand. But the last 20 years, we've only seen the widening. We've only seen the widening of this gap, and Thailand is ripe. And populism has been given a bad name, but I think sometimes it's a necessary halfway house to progress and change. So Thailand has been ripe for populism, and Thaksin came along and kind of captured it, right? He captured the electorate, but also captivated the collective imagination. He awakened these marginalized voices, and they felt connected to the system for the first time. And of course, he had corruption and cronyism and everything else, but he also had a game for Thailand, and he also empowered a lot of people who were previously neglected. And Thailand is still today, after 25 years, ripe for populism. You mentioned, future forward, move forward. It doesn't have to be them, whatever party, but this place is crying for some kind of leadership to get us beyond, to bridge this gap, to address this gap, and to provide avenues for modernization. So the next wave of demands is not about the income redistribution that Thaksin was was about, populism, income redistribution, cheap healthcare, microcredit schemes, and then you name it, debt suspension, all catering to the rural masses. The next stage, next wave of populist base and basis will be structural reforms. And that structural reforms, I think, the best outcome would be some kind of a compromise whereby the established centers of power are willing for their own self-enlightened interests to allow for some reforms to take place. But what we have seen and are seeing is the opposite direction, which is to clamp down hard, to keep the lid tight, and disregard the combustibility. And that is very dangerous for Thailand.
May I say one more sentence? When I was a member of the Democrat Party, for many years I was trying to convince my other colleagues to come out with a set of socio-economic development for Thailand as a challenge to a set of populist policy measures introduced by Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra. But I did fail completely. And on top of that, when we became the government under Abhisit, we also added some element to the populist policy life of the Kingdom of Thailand. So I think the onus, the responsibility fell on a lot of political parties of Thailand for not having the guts and the determination to oppose populist policy measures. Everyone more or less came along. For example, the 30 baht health service for 40 million people continues to this very day, instead of making Thailand having a one health system instead of a three system at this point in time. One system for the bureaucrats, one system for the private sector employees, and the third system for the 40 million farmers and workers and so on. And this is a reflection of inequality and the discriminatory treatment. But we need, I think, more or less political parties to come out with a one system proposal and other socio-economic measures. So we have failed as a society altogether. But having heard what the four panelists have said, maybe it gives us a bit of encouragement to dare to do things that would be totally in the opposite direction of populist policy measures. Thank you very much.
All right. So I want to answer to Ajahn Paul's question regarding the condition or the factor for the rise of the populism. Actually, in my book, I lay out like the basic condition, the structural condition of like a populism, which the same as the Professor Carlos mentioned, the polarization, which out like the polarization, the populist actor that can be whether the charismatic leader can be political party or even the political movement cannot have like the key content to mobilize the people, to create the polarity between the people and the enemy of the people. So the basic condition should be the polarization. And the second one, as Ajahn Jay already mentioned, if people happy, so it's quite difficult to mobilize the people vote. So the second condition is like the discontent or the grievance of the people, especially directing toward the establishment. So that's the second condition. And in my book, I lay out the one of like the trigger, that is the crisis. The crisis play the role as like the trigger to the rise of the populism. And another point that I would like to raise is like, you know, in Thailand, I think we have like, we fall into the trap of the value judgment. As Ajahn Jay mentioned, it can be good or bad. As Ajahn Carlos, Professor Carlos and Kun Pepe mentioned, it can either good or bad to the democracy. So, but I think the problem in Thailand is like we try to associate populism with the certain type of economic policy, redistribution policy. But as we can see from like another example of for the case of the Philippines or the country around the world, I think there's no single type of populist policy. It's varied. It's varied. It can be leftist. It can be rightist. It can be in the middle. It can be the war against drug. It can be the anti-immigration. So it can be anything. So you cannot associate the populism with the policy, with the public policy. And in Thailand, as in another country as well, populism is used as the political labeling, especially to like labeling the opponent as like as the actor that try to promote the responsible policy, or as the actor who try to destroy the political system. So I think that's the way we try to attack the taxonomic or taxonopopulism. All right, that's all. Thank you.
Just one last thing that we didn't quite touch as much when it comes to the prevention of populism would be the role of strong civil society. Right? Civil society in some cases could have been co-opted by the populist leaders, like in the case of Venezuela again, in the case of Ecuador again. But as we see in the case of the US, for example, a very strong and vibrant civil society, for example, Black Lives Matter, right? During Trump's first term, did a very good job of, checking and, challenging Trump's tendency, predilection towards more authoritarian measures. So we should not just look at the role of, the institutional powers like political parties or the opposition parties, but the civil society itself as well, the independent, strong in civil society could be, one of the ways that prevent, populist autocratizing tendencies. That's it for me. Yeah, and also media. Yeah, correct. Like strong independent media that didn't get co-opted, right? We see actually in many cases where populists, the very first things that the populists in power did was to come up with some kind of laws to control media, to bring private media into the hands of the state, and then control what the reporters, what the journalists can or cannot say. So yeah, independent media and independent, strong civil society as well.
I hate to say this, but we're about running out of time now, like at 3:30. So thank you, the panelists. Thank you, Ajahn Carlos, Ajahn Thitinan, Ajahn Nithi, and Pepe Tritep. And thanks for Ajahn Paul for the question, Margaret, Ambassador Gasit, and who else? And Ajahn Kasem for the question. And thanks everyone for attending this Populism in the Global South panel. Okay, we hope to organize something like this in the future again soon. Thank you.